Welcome to the fourth distinguished lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce Larry Zitnik, who is a research director for the fundamental AI team at Meta. He has had a pretty interesting trajectory. He got his PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and then he was a researcher at Microsoft Research, where he did some really cool work in computer vision, DNA, photo-DNA, which is like very well known and very well widely used across multiple tech firms. But since he joined Meta, he has been doing some really cool work on trying to use AI for scientific discoveries and even batteries. So looking forward to what you're going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I guess I was at Microsoft Research for 10 years, hanging out with a lot of you at UW. It's kind of cool to be back in Seattle. I miss it. And it's great to be here today. So today I'm going to be talking about something that is a little unusual. I'm going to be talking about atoms and AI. Thank you for showing up. I know this is an area that's probably outside of a lot of your expertise. And hopefully you can learn a little bit today about what it's like to work in chemistry, material science, and AI. And hopefully this will serve as a good introduction to that. But out of curiosity, is anybody here from experimental or computational chemistry? All right, so there are some actual, OK, good. You guys can hold me accountable if I say anything wrong and screw things up. My background is machine learning and computer vision. So if you question me too deeply, I'll fall apart. All right, so I like to start off by looking at this science paper. And in this science paper, it states, many statements you may think are of an alarmist order. Certainly, they are depressing, but they are founded in stubborn facts. And the paper goes on to say, all civilized nations stand in deadly peril. Now, this is a pretty dire science paper, obviously, right? But what is interesting about this paper is that it was not written today. This was actually written in 1898. So what were they so concerned about in 1898? This sounds like it sounds like it would be written today, right? But in 1898, what were they worried about? They were worried about not having enough to eat. Our wheat-producing soils are totally unequal to the strain put upon it. And the reason for this is that the way that they were able to support their lifestyle, support the wheat harvest, was through the mining of fertilizer, mainly bird poo. And the good sources of bird poo, which was like the best fertilizer of the time, were running dry. There wasn't any more to mine. And they didn't know what they were going to do next. And they were worried about the world starving as a repercussion. So who was going to come to the rescue? Who was going to save the day?
Birds. Chemistry.
Birds. Yes. The chemists in here are like, the chemist. Yeah. It wasn't the AI researchers, I'll guarantee you that. It was a chemist. It is a chemist who must come to the rescue of the threatened communities. It is through the laboratory that starvation may be ultimately turned to plenty. Right? And they were calling on the chemists, you have to study this problem. And two chemists that heeded this call were Haber and Bosch. And they figured out a way to take nitrogen, which is very plentiful in the air, but it's really, really happy to be in the air, and figure out how to get it out of the air, combine it with hydrogen to create ammonia fertilizer. And through this process and through their work, they're able to find a way to create fertilizer. And the world's population has since gone up by 4.8x. So you think about the scientific advances that we've made in the last couple hundred years, and you think which ones had the biggest, most fundamental breakthroughs and biggest impact on our society, this is one of them. If we didn't have this technology, we would only be able to support about half the people that exist on the planet today. All right, that was a history lesson. Let's go to today. What do we care about now? What matters in 2024? Well, as many of you guys think of, it's climate change, right? This is one of the biggest problems that we have today. It's our existential crisis that we're having now. And to this point, we've been thinking about we need to use more renewable energy. And using batteries, we can help decarbonize the grid or decarbonize our cars. Probably a lot of you might own battery-powered cars by now. But the problem is that there's all these other areas which also need to be decarbonized, which produce huge amounts of CO2. And it's non-trivial to figure out how to do that. Now, one of the ways we can do that is through something called upcycling. So we can take something like water. We can use renewable energy to break that water into hydrogen and oxygen. We can then use that hydrogen in other purposes, like making steel or heating, et cetera. But then there's all these other applications that still aren't addressed, that can't be addressed with just hydrogen. So what we need to do is figure out other ways of upcycling other products, like taking CO2 along with hydrogen to create other fuels or other feedstocks, and then basically be able to decarbonize the entire society. So the big thing here, hopefully you're getting, is that we need to do this thing called upcycling. What is upcycling? It's essentially chemical reactions, where we need to combine different reactants together to create different products that are useful for our society, which don't use fossil fuels. So all we need to do is run those chemical reactions. But what's the big problem is that those chemical reactions are a lot more expensive than just pulling the fossil fuels out of the ground and using them. So if we want to solve this problem, we want to help mitigate climate change, we need to figure out a way to run these chemical reactions cost effectively. And one of the key ways of doing this is to find better catalysts for these reactions. So what is a catalyst? A catalyst is a material used to increase the rate of a chemical reaction without being consumed in the process. All right, that's a technical description, but let me actually give you some intuition about how a catalyst actually works. So here we have a Toyota Mirai. It has a fuel cell in its engine, so it takes hydrogen and oxygen from the air to create electricity and water. And underneath its engine is this fuel cell. It has an anode and a cathode in it. And in the cathode, there's a chemical reaction that occurs. And this chemical reaction uses a catalyst. So let's look at how that reaction works. So we have the oxygen with 4 protons, or you think about hydrogen, that then create the water. So we want to run this chemical reaction. So we have a catalyst, which in this case is going to be platinum. And then we have something called an absorbate, which is the molecule of interest in the chemical reaction, which is here going to be oxygen. So that oxygen, when it comes in contact with the platinum catalyst, what happens is a bond between the 2 oxygen atoms weakens, because one of those oxygen atoms is being attracted by the platinum. And because that bond's weaker, when 2 hydrogens come into play, they can more easily pull off that oxygen atom to create a water molecule. And then you get 2 more hydrogens or protons coming in, and they can easily pull off that other oxygen to create another water molecule. So you can think of these catalysts as kind of like a bond weakener to allow that chemical reaction to proceed using less energy. Less energy means cheaper. It means less electricity or less heat you have to add to the system. The key thing is that the catalyst has to be just right. It can't attract the absorbate too strongly, because then it'll just cover the entire surface and the reaction grinds to a halt. It can't attract it too weakly, because then it doesn't have any effect at all. So the catalyst has to be just right, where it attracts it just strongly enough to make that chemical reaction occur at the rate that you want. The problem is that the catalysts that work well for a lot of the applications we care about, like fuel cells, green hydrogen generation, et cetera, are expensive. They're things like platinum, iridium, other things like that. We need to find less expensive catalysts. All right. So this is a problem that I initially became interested in after talking to a bunch of computational chemists and was really excited to work on. And now we think about the journey. How do we actually find new catalysts? Well, first thing we need to do is we need to find new catalyst materials that we might use. Next thing we need to do is we need to screen those catalysts, screen those materials, which ones actually be good catalysts. And then we need to test them in the lab. And then we need to do a ton of other things after this that I'm going to ignore for this talk to actually get it to industrial scale, but we'll ignore that to then take it all the way up. But in this talk, I'm going to go through these first 3 steps. So the first thing I want to talk about is how do we actually find materials that can be used as catalysts. So when we think about materials, in your head, mentally think of things like this. It's a bunch of atoms in a box that you repeat infinitely, which has some sort of crystalline structure. Right? And what we need to do is find sets of atoms that like to be around each other that we can then create in the real world. So you might ask, how many materials like these are actually known in the world? Well, a popular online data set called the Materials Project has about 155,000 of these. But if you look at which ones of these are actually useful for, let's say, a chemical reaction that you're interested in, there might only be, let's say, 6,000 of them, which isn't that big of a search space. But as you might imagine, there's millions, billions of possibilities of arranging atoms in these boxes in different ways to create different materials. So one of the big exciting areas right now is how do we discover brand new materials that haven't ever been synthesized or created before. So one of the ways we do this computationally, or explore this problem computationally, is the following. So imagine we have the energy of a material made 100% out of zinc here on the left, and the energy of a material made out of 100% copper there on the right, and they have this certain amount of energy. And let's say you find a new arrangement of atoms, which has 50% copper, 50% zinc, which has lower energy. So then you can say, this material, since it has lower energy, is going to happen in the real world. Like, we could create this because it has lower energy. Maybe. Because there might actually exist another material that's 50% copper, 50% zinc, which is a slightly different arrangement of the atom, which has an even lower energy. And if you find something of even lower energy, it's more likely that this thing isn't going to exist in the real world, but the other one is. Right? Because the world likes things at low energy. Everything wants to be at the lowest energy state as possible. And then you might find something else over here, which is 75% zinc, 25% copper, and you can basically create this convex hull. If you've ever if you've seen the work, DeepMind, Microsoft have worked on this as well. They're talking about the convex hull. This is the convex hull they're talking about. What you're trying to do is find the materials that have an energy which is on that convex hull, and those are the materials that are most likely to be realizable in the real world. I did not say they are realizable in the real world. I'd say they're more likely to be realized in the real world. So the story is actually a little bit more complex. So imagine you have these two different points, both made out of 100% carbon. The one there on the left has a lower energy than the one on the right. So obviously, the one on the right, if you did actually create it, would decompose, right, and turn into the material on the left. But it turns out that the thing on the left is the shape of a diamond, and the thing on the right is graphite. As all you know who might have diamonds on right here, your diamond is perfectly stable and just happy as it is. If you waited a few billion years, yes, the diamond probably would transform into graphite, but it does it very slowly. And the reason for this is you have to consider the entire energy landscape. It's possible that you might have something of higher energy, but if you look at how much energy it takes to transition from one material to the next, is that it can take a lot of energy to do that. So it is possible to have something that's stable that's not the lowest energy. So there's a lot of very kind of interesting complications here, and that's one of the reasons why, even if computationally you think of something as promising, if you don't know the full energy landscape, you still don't know whether it is truly stable in the real world or not. So up to this point, I've been talking a lot about the energy. So we need to find something that's a lower energy. So you have a bunch of atoms. Yeah?
Sorry, on the last slide, can you say anything about what constitutes the x-axis here?
Made up. Yeah, there's not the other one had an obvious x-axis. This one was just different parts of some arbitrary space. All right, so up until this point, I've been talking about the energy. And obviously, all this depends upon the energy, because you want to find materials of lower energy. So how do we actually compute that energy? So the way we do this is we take a bunch of atoms, we put them in a box. We relax those atoms by computing the forces on those atoms. We update the atom positions, and then we repeat. We compute the forces again, update the atom positions, keep repeating until you find a local energy minimum, and that's your relaxed structure. And given the relaxed structure, you then have whatever energy corresponds to that is your relaxed energy for that material. It's pretty simple. So what you really need to do is figure out some way of computing those forces and computing that energy. How do we do that? We use something called density functional theory. And for the anybody from computer vision out here, anytime during this talk I say DFT, I'm not saying discrete Fourier transform. I'm not saying that. I'm saying density functional theory. All right? So DFT estimates the atomic energy and forces. It iteratively does this by computing the electron density. It's an eigenvalue problem. And the key thing to know is that it is order n cubed with a number of electrons in your system. What this means is that it's really, really expensive. If you have just a small number of atoms, you can do it relatively quickly, in minutes. But if you have hundreds of atoms or thousands of atoms, you're talking hours or days of compute to do this. So to do that relaxation could probably take a day. Well, that's a smaller number of atoms. But with a reasonable number of atoms, relaxations a lot of times will take a day to compute. And this also means that for some applications, like if you want to study an entire nanoparticle or study an entire protein, which have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of atoms, you can't use this. It's just too computationally expensive. So as I said, a single relaxation using DFT takes hours, and there's billions of different possibilities. So a really big limiting factor right now is that DFT is reasonably accurate. It allows us to compute these energies and forces, but it's so slow, it doesn't allow us to actually sweep through and discover new materials without blowing a huge amount of computation. So what can we do? How can we solve this problem? How do we reduce something that takes hours or days down to less than a second? Well, this is finally where AI or ML comes to the rescue, along with chemists, of course. And the way we're going to do this, if we want to solve this problem, if you want to solve something with AI or ML, what's the first thing you need to do? Got to create a data set. So what we did is we did 118 million DFT calculations using Meta Compute. This took about 20 million hours of compute to process. And this is using, like, imagine when the sun's over the Pacific and we're not serving up as many cat videos on Facebook. We're essentially just running DFT simulations on those servers. We don't care if we get kicked off. Any spare compute you give us, we'll take it, and we just run DFT calculations. And we're able to take this data, and we open source it all for the community to use, along with the models that we built on top of it. So, and this is like orders of magnitude more than the data that existed out there before it. So what's in this data? What is this actual problem? So as inputs, we have, it's very simple. We just have the 3D positions of the atoms and their atomic numbers, which element they are, copper, iron, et cetera. And then as output, all you need to compute is a single number, which is the energy of the overall system. And then for every atom, the force on the atom, just a 3-dimensional vector. That's easy. That's it. Easy peasy. Like inputs, that's that, outputs that. So that's all you need to do to understand this problem. It's just like those are the inputs, your outputs. The way that we study this generally is use something called a graph neural network, where we have each node equals to an atom, each edge equals a neighbor, and then the edges are just like your local neighborhood. And then when you have a graph neural network, generally they take this form. We have a node embedding here x, and then we update it using message passing between the different nodes that are edges along each edge. All right? Now, for this graph neural network, one interesting question is, what is x? Like, what is the embedding that we use for each node or for each atom? So when we think about, like, say, image detection or image classification, what representation do we use? We use a 2D representation, right? Where we run a CNN across the image. Obviously, that's not a really great representation for these atoms. What is a better representation that we can think of for atoms? What do we care about? Well, for atoms, we have a specific atom, like a target atom here in the middle that we care about. And what we care about is what are the orientations and the distances of all the other atoms relative to it. And for that, we've found that you want a spherical representation. So instead of having a planar representation like you might have for images, for these atoms, we're going to have the sphere. So think of it as a function over a sphere, where each point in that function tells you what properties, what exists in this orientation away from you in that direction. All right? So how do we then represent this function on a sphere? If you're me, coming from a computer vision background, what would be the first thing that you would try? Nope. Discretized grid. Because because everything, like CNNs are discretized over the thing. So I was like, of course you just discretize it. Of course, this has issues though. If you try to rotate anything, then you have to resample. Discretizing a sphere, or you can't do it evenly. There's obviously different, like you get higher discretization near the poles. A lot of issues with that. So instead of doing that, use what Rick just mentioned, which is much smarter. Only the smartest of computer vision people would realize this first off, which is you should use spherical harmonics. So what are spherical harmonics? So basically you have a set of coefficients which specify your function and a set of basic functions y. And y are the spherical harmonics that look like this. So all you're doing is taking a linear combination of those functions there to create your function over the sphere. So why do we use spherical harmonics? Well, they have some really, really interesting and amazing properties. Now, before I go into this, people also use spherical harmonics to measure or to model the electron density of atoms and all that sort of thing. This has nothing to do with that. I mean, they use it for that for similar reasons and similar properties. But the reason that we use spherical harmonics for this problem is not because people model the electron density using spherical harmonics. So take those and just or like rip them apart. Like they're maybe slightly related, but not as related as you might think they might be. All right. So just to restate again, spherical harmonics, you have a set of coefficients here. You multiply that by your basis functions, and you get an arbitrary function on the sphere. Now, what's really cool about spherical harmonics is you can take those coefficients, and you can multiply it by something called a Wigner-D matrix. And what happens when you multiply it by the Wigner-D matrix? Exactly. It rotates a function. So you can perfectly rotate your function any way you want by basically multiplying those coefficients by the Wigner-D matrix. So it gives you a lossless way of rotating that function, which is really cool mathematically. It's similar to steerable filters in computer vision, for anybody in computer vision here. Same underlying principle. Now, when you're doing these messages, one thing that's useful is to create a local reference frame. So let's say we want to pass a message between the red atom and the gray atom here. Is we can create a local reference frame where you have the red atom at the origin, and let's say the gray atom is along the y-axis. Now, what's interesting in this is that you just removed 5 of the 6 degrees of freedom, because 3 degrees translation by putting it into the orientation, and then 2 degrees of rotation. But there's still 1 more degree of rotation, which is that rotation about the y-axis. So if we want to do a way of passing messages, we need to make sure that our neural network is equivariant with regards to that final degree of rotation. And I don't have enough time today to get into equivariance, but for those who know what I'm talking about, hopefully you get that. But then what we can do then is you take the source and target node. We have our spherical embeddings. You rotate them by the Wigner-D matrix, and then you can basically rotate them such that the source atom is always below the target atom along the y-axis. So they're always perfectly aligned. So the neural network can assume that you always have this special alignment. And once you have that, then all you need to do is a convolution about that remaining degree of freedom to make sure that the network is essentially invariant to like rotations along this axis. And the cool thing is, since you're just doing a 1D rotation here, is that convolution is actually quite cheap, because you can think of it as like a one-dimensional convolution. If you do that in the Fourier domain, essentially spherical harmonics are a Fourier domain representation of a function on a sphere. You get really nice mathematical properties, which allow you to do this convolution very efficiently. So by doing this trick that I just mentioned, if you look at this paper that I referenced here at the bottom, you can get all the mathematics behind it. But you can see that you can take something that would be order L to the 6, where L is the order of the spherical harmonics, and get it down to L cubed, which makes it computationally much, much, much more efficient. And what that means practically is that instead of only being able to model your atoms using a small number of basis functions, is you can model it using a much larger set of basis functions, which gives you much higher resolution, which means that your force and energy estimations will be much more accurate. And if you want to learn more about this in equivariance, I do have a YouTube video out there, and it'll go into more detail on that specific thing. But I don't want to blow the whole talk on just that, because there's a lot of more interesting things to talk about. All right. So if you take this model and you apply it to this problem, so the EQV2 is Equiformer V2. And this is a data set that's looking at a material discovery. And we apply it to this problem, and it gets top of the leaderboard. If you take the open material data set, which I mentioned earlier, and you train it on that, you get even like more dramatic improvements. So that's the model at the very top, is trained on that large data set that I just mentioned. So a critical thing to make these models give you accurate energies and forces is training on large and very diverse data. One thing I want to call out is that field right there, which is that's the energy mean absolute error. And what's interesting is the top model there is getting 0.02 EV energy error. And DFT itself is an approximation. And it depends on what level of theory you're using in your DFT calculations as to how accurate they are. And DFT in general, it's not going to get you much better than 0.02 EV error. So we're kind of approaching the same accuracy that you would have with DFT on this. If we use a higher level of theory, you can push that number down and we can make the models a little bit more accurate. But we are getting to the point where these models can be good DFT surrogates, which is exciting. One question that you might have, though, is, OK, we just told you how to compute the energies. But we still need to say, like, how do we actually come up with the materials that we might then compute the energy on? Right? You could randomly just sample atoms, throw them in a box, do relaxations, and just do that millions and billions of times. But as you might imagine, that could be computationally quite expensive. So there are other ways of kind of coming up with brand new materials that might be good to test. Well, this is where you go into generative AI. Everybody's excited about that now. But you can take similar models, similar techniques, such as flow matching, and apply them to this space and this is a few papers that our team has had in the last year in this, but you can use the same sort of generative models to then discover is the wrong word, but to generate potential hypotheses for new materials to then try out. All right. So that is still only half the picture. And the one thing that's interesting is that tells you that there might be a material that has low energy, just like we know that there might be something called a tasty chocolate cake. But just because you know that a chocolate cake exists and that it tastes really good, it doesn't tell you how to actually make it. And as we'll get into later in this talk a little bit, actually making the materials, a lot harder. Well, it's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. But it's quite challenging. It's about as hard as making this chocolate cake if you had no idea how to make a cake. All right. So we just talked about finding catalyst materials. Let's get to the next step. Now let's say we have a large set of catalyst materials. How do we actually screen them? So here we go back to what I mentioned before, right? We want a catalyst to kind of attract that molecule, not too weakly, not too strongly. And one way to kind of think about this is something they call a volcano plot, where here is just plotting the absorption energy for a certain molecule. Here is just oxygen. And you have things that are too strong there on the left and too weak on the right. And you want it to be just right, just kind of near the top, like the platinum is. So how do we compute like how strongly that absorbate is going to be attracted, that molecule is going to be attracted to the catalyst surface? Well, you do this in a very similar way to what we mentioned before, which is we take an absorbate, we place it near the catalyst. We then relax the atom positions once again, but this time with the absorbate. And then we look at the relaxed energy. And that gives us an indication of that's the absorption energy. And that allows us to make an estimate of the reaction rate. So once again, we are using the exact same model architectures, et cetera. But now we're going to train it on different data. We're not going to be training it on those bulk materials. We want to train it on a data set of catalyst surfaces and absorbates. So if we now want to study this problem, what do we need? Well, we need a collaboration with people that actually know what they're doing in computational chemistry and experimental chemistry. So we collaborated really closely with Carnegie Mellon and University of Toronto to create the Open Catalyst project several years ago. I can't tell you how awesome it is to work with these people, work with these folks. It's so important to have good domain experts to work with. I'm forever thankful to be working with these folks. And together, we created something called the Open Catalyst 2020 and 2022 data sets. Now, the last data set I mentioned took 20 million hours to compute. This one had 140 million training examples, and these two data sets combined took over 500 million hours of compute. This is a massive amount of compute. This is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of servers running 24/7 for months on end, doing nothing but running DFT calculations. And as always, we open sourced it for the community to use. We train models on it for the community to use as well. So when we started this project in 2018, 2019, these are kind of like the force errors that we had. And we had like next generation of models, started improving them a little bit more, and the next generation got even better. The model that I described earlier is the ESCN, and Ecoformer V2 are the models that utilize the spherical harmonics and those tricks that I mentioned at the beginning. And you see the errors are getting lower and lower. And so that's been really great to see, this kind of continuous improvement. And just to kind of give you an example, this is the ESCN model shown in the blue line, and it doing a relaxation. And then the orange line is DFT, the ground truth, doing the relaxation. And you see this is a pretty complex relaxation. Like that molecule's doing all sorts of crazy things, and it's finding a similar local minima. And its optimization step is here on the x-axis, but if the x-axis was like actually time, it would be dramatically different. Like DFT would take 1,000 times longer than the ML prediction. This is an example of it working. It doesn't always work, as you might imagine. There's failure cases.
Does it work because it got to the same Y position?
It works because, you want to get the same. In general, what you care about is the energy. You don't care about the exact placement of the atoms. But in order to get the exact energy, generally you need it to be essentially the same position of the atoms, unless you're at like a mirror symmetry saddle point, that sort of thing. But you want to be the same Y. You don't have to take the exact same path. There's like a lot of times like a little bit of numerical instability can kind of lead it one way or the other, that sort of thing.
Just because your absorbent that's moving around is so complicated, what is that molecule with 2 grays and 1 red?
So quiz, come on guys, answer. Chemist and crap. Ethanol. There you go. Excellent. I wasn't sure if anybody knew the answer. It's ethanol. All right. Yeah.
What do you read into your algorithm, or the optimization algorithm converging with your force field ahead of the DFT? Is this a fault of the DFT? Is it a stochastic optimization algorithm?
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit stochastic. The the force fields that we compute with the ML models obviously have a little bit of noise in them. So you actually will see both. There's other examples that you have where it'll kind of go, a lot of times you relax and it'll come down and it'll kind of plateau for a little while, and then it goes down again like this. And it's just like a little bit of wiggle can make it go earlier or later, so there's just a little bit of stochasticity, in that process. So, and you can see here it has like a little bit of a blue wiggle maybe at the beginning. Maybe it just kind of got it in a slightly different position to get it there a little bit quicker. But don't take that as, like, that is not saying it's faster. Like, this is just how many times you computed the forces, updated that position, computed forces. Like, the blue line estimating the forces is just like literally 10,000 times faster. So
There's not like a systematic, I suppose, overestimation of the gradients near the number.
no, like when we do relaxations, we basically take the call to DFT and we replace that with a call to the ML model, and we use exactly the same code otherwise. Right? So it's like a plug and play replacement.
So is the main benefit over DFT that it's computationally more efficient?
Yes.
Of AI, is there anything else AI can get?
There's a lot of other things that AI can do, like generating new materials to possibly study and that sort of thing. But you can think of DFT, it's, I'll get to this a little later, but like it is a fundamental simulation tool that is used across chemistry, across material science, and being able to make that from a tool that takes a day to get an answer to getting it, like imagine if you could run something on your laptop and you get an answer in a couple seconds versus waiting a day. Like that changes how people study problems. So that is a very critical problem. Yeah, so that is one of the big things. So you want it fast and accurate. And then DFT can only handle up to 1,000 atoms. Like if we could do 10,000 atoms, 100,000 atoms, that changes how you might think about a problem as well. Yeah?
Why does DFT scale cubically?
It's an eigenvalue problem with the number of electrons. So if you just do eigenvalue like decomposition, that's like a order n cubed problem.
You can't really do like any sort of far field approximation in this setting.
You might be able to, but then like, I personally don't know. But from my understanding, it's like if you do approximations, it's not accurate enough, anymore. So it's there's been a lot of work in speeding up DFT, but it is a very challenging problem. They do make a bunch of approximations. Like, for instance, you only model the electrons that are on the outer shell, and you don't ignore the electrons on the inner part because they don't impact things as much when you have bigger atoms, that sort of thing. So there's a bunch of different approximations you can make.
Maybe one more question. You said that the data set actually was based on DFT calculations, but you also said that DFT calculations don't scale after 1,000 atoms. So if you're training on the data set which is with 1,000 atoms, does the same model actually scale to more than that?
The hope would be that something like forces, like that is generally it is a local property. It is not always a local property. You can have electrostatics and other things that are much larger, farther afield, but for most cases, your forces will be dependent upon only the local area, of the atoms around you. So that would allow you to, like the locality assumption could generally hold.
But if that's the case, could you do like a more sophisticated thing on like even smaller, like use like a more sophisticated approximation than DFT on even smaller things and hopefully generalize? So like why DFT then?
So DFT is n cubed with the number of electrons. The next, I'll call it vaguely popular approach, is coupled cluster, and that's order n to the 7th power. So then you're talking, 5 atoms.
What's the scale of like how local to the forces? How many atoms out do you have to go to like model the forces?
We use a neighborhood of 20 atoms, generally. You do get a slight improvement when you go up to 40. So just to give you kind of an idea. Yeah.
I was wondering if this problem is amenable to quantum at all.
I think it would be amenable to quantum if you had a lot of qubits, but you need a lot. And given that there's not, I don't see that being amenable, unless we, any time in the near term future. And to be honest with you, it's just like the planet's going to be baked before it becomes real. So we need to solve it with today's compute. So but maybe. I haven't fully, I think if you want to do like the order n to the 7th power 1 and make that actually efficient and be able to do it, like that would be your solution. But we need quantum computing to get, I think, quite a bit farther along, from what I understand. All right. So what I just described is how to do relaxation. So you have an absorbate, and you have a catalyst down there, and then you can do relaxation, and you get a relaxed structure. But if you take that absorbate and you put it someplace else on the catalyst surface, you're going to get another relaxed structure, get another local minimum. You put it here, you get another local minimum. And what you really care about is actually the global minimum of where that absorbate could be anywhere on the catalyst surface. Because that's where the absorbate is probably going to go in the real world. So the way that we can do that is we just run a ton of ML relaxations, just randomly placing the absorbate on top of the catalyst. And then you can find the one with the lowest energy as predicted by ML. And if that accuracy isn't high enough for you, you can just take that one final state and run DFT on just that to refine your energy. And if you use this hybrid approach, you can use ML plus DFT, where you're just doing a small number of DFT calculations. And this will be 700 to 1,000 times faster than using DFT alone, which is really great. Now, but is this accurate, which might be one of your questions. Well, if we use one of the models, such as Chenet, which had a high force error, our success rate, which is an energy MAE below 100 millieVs, it won't work. Like, it'll relax to some arbitrary wrong thing, so it'll never give you the right answer. The next layer of machine learning force fields, do slightly better. And you remember how I showed the graph of the forces as they were going down? And it seemed like they were kind of plateauing as you went down. What's interesting is, yeah, they started plateauing and the improvement wasn't quite as much. But that little bit of improvement in forces leads to really big improvements when you actually use them in practice. So using these most state-of-the-art models, 90% of the time we are successful in finding an absorption energy which is really close to what you get if you just use DFT by itself. All right, so let's get practical here. Let's say that we do have a new material and we want to compute the absorption energies. What do we actually have to do? So we have a bulk, we have a chunk of that material. Now, a catalyst is not a chunk of material. You actually have to slice it to figure out which surface you want to use. So you could use that surface. You could use that surface. You could slice it this way. You could slice it that way. And if you slice it that way, you can slice it there. You can slice it here. You can slice it there. Right? There's a lot of different ways of slicing it. So there's 90 possible ways of slicing it. Generally, a chemical reaction doesn't have a single molecule in it. There's all these other absorbates, all these other intermediate molecules involved in it. So let's say there's 5 different absorbates that you care about. And like I said, with that relaxation, you want to find the global minimum. So you have to sample 100 different places. So if you want to study a single material, one material, how many relaxations do you need to perform? Well, you have 90 different slices times 5 different absorbates times 100 different placements means you have to perform 45,000 relaxations. If you did this with DFT, how long would it take? How long?
90 million years.
No, not nearly that much. Only 120 years. But 120 years is still a long time. But using these ML and DFT approach that I just mentioned, you can get it down to 2.5 days on a GPU and 70 days on CPU. So is it expensive? Yes. Is it feasible? Yes. So it is now feasible to do this at scale, especially if you're at Meta and you have a ton of GPUs and CPUs. You can actually then start doing large screening of materials. All right. So we discussed how do we find catalyst materials. We just talked about how we can computationally screen them at scale. And to be able to do this, we did a lot of work over the last 5 years where we built large data sets. We built accurate ML, DFT surrogates, fast material search. We've made absorption energy calculations feasible at that scale. But to be honest with you, none of this matters if it doesn't correlate with what we're seeing experimentally, if it actually has real-world impact. We can have better simulations, but if the simulations aren't correct, then why were you bothering? So for us, one of the things that we found really important was we wanted to map this to the real-world lab, to experiments done in the real world. So the next challenge was testing the catalyst out in the lab and seeing if any of these models are indicative of anything that we're seeing experimentally. Do you have experimental chemists here? There's a couple. All right. Awesome. So the two initial reactions that we started looking at were HER, or hydrogen evolution reaction, which takes water and electricity and produces hydrogen. This is only half the, HER is only half the reaction. There's an anode and cathode, but you don't need to know about that. And then there's CO2RR, which takes CO2 plus hydrogen and renewable energy to create other fuels, like ethanol or methane or airplane fuel, that sort of thing. So these are two very important reactions for helping us mitigate climate issues. So how many known materials are out there? We had the materials project. I mentioned for these applications, it's like 6K that might be amenable. If we look at all the other materials out there that are also computationally been looked at, we can get that number up to 19,000. So we wanted to analyze 19,000 materials for these. So going into this, okay, again, I'm an ML person. I'm a computer vision person. I really knew I learned a bunch about computational chemistry, and I knew even less about experimental chemistry. And my mental model for what this was going to look like was the following. We have these 19,000 materials. All we have to do is go and order a bunch of those materials. I know you're laughing. And then we just test them at scale, right? Easy peasy. And in my mind, man, testing them at scale, that's going to be really hard. But at least, I wasn't even thinking about number one. But it turned out that I had it slightly wrong. So the first thing you need to do is after talking to some of our experimental friends, I'm like, hey, just make a bunch of these materials. They're like, no, you can't just do that. And then we reached out to an academic institution and said, well, we can generate a whole ton of materials. And I was like, great. Let's do that. So they generated some materials, and I was really optimistic that they would be able to generate a wide variety of materials. And then we said, okay, now we're going to take those materials and we need to stick them to the electrode to actually run the testing experiments. An electrode is like carbon paper. And we stuck them to the electrode, and it basically destroyed the electrode because we had to heat it up, and the electrode essentially burnt. So that didn't work. So we had to go find another way to synthesize materials. So we literally reached out to every single company we could find out there, 50 different ones. Only a handful of them responded. Believe it or not many companies want to deal with a bunch of people who say, I want you to create this set of 100 different materials in very small batches. They just didn't want to do that. They like to create one material at a very large batch. So that was really challenging, but we were able to find some other ways that we found a couple places which looked promising. We sent it out to a small list to about 8 different companies, and about 2 different ways came back which could actually create those small number of materials. And that's what we proceeded with. But then after you create those materials, you have to do something called characterization. So you make the materials, you basically take the cake, you put it in the oven, and then characterizing means you take it out of the oven, and then you taste it and see if it tastes like a chocolate cake, right? Because a lot of times you mix it all together and you taste it, and you're like, no, it didn't work. So we would then characterize the materials. And the characterization is seeing if you get the mixture of elements right, and then whether the atoms have the right arrangement of crystal structure, using XRF and XRD for the chemistry folks out there. And of course, they came back, and they weren't what we wanted. So you get problems like you take that material, and you create it in the air. What happens is the oxygen atoms like to get themselves stuck within the material as well, and you get an oxide material rather than a pure metal material, for instance. Or like the techniques that we're using just aren't reproducible enough, and like the composition is too far off. We had all sorts of issues in this, going back and forth, trying to be able to create the materials that we wanted. Or you get multi-phase materials, which means like instead of creating this crystal structure, you created 30% of this crystal structure and 70% of this other crystal structure, and it's like a mixture of the two. So we went around and ran around. And this took us about 2 years of going through this process to then find some ways to make this work. And we eventually did. And then we could finally test them at scale. And testing at scale was like the easy part, or like relatively. It was the synthesis that was the really challenging challenge. All right. So for the actual synthesis, we had 2 different ways that we found that worked. One was using chemical reduction. This is a ChemSpeed, and this is being done by the University of Toronto. This is Ji Hoon, who's a postdoc who's running this. He was the hero of this whole project. And what this does is basically takes a bunch of the elements that you have and puts them into a liquid, like a jar with liquid in it. It mixes them all together, evaporates that, and creates basically a powder of that material. And you can see here, it can handle a certain part of the chemical space shown in blue. Things like that are red, we would have oxidation issues, like I mentioned, like the oxygen getting involved into the materials. And this is a fairly well-known process, but it had a limited chemical space. And the other method that we discovered was this new company that we had just heard of was called VS Particle, had this new technique for printing materials essentially using a 3D printer type of device, where they take a metal rod, they pass an electric spark on it, which then vaporizes some of the metal. They then spray that metal onto a surface. You can have multiple metals which all spray it, and it creates these little nanoparticles that go onto the surface. And then you can basically heat up the resulting thing to then anneal the nanoparticles to create the crystal structure that you want. And this process has a much larger chemical space that it can occupy. It turned out to be a lot more reproducible. The nanoparticles were much more consistent in the size that they were. And it was really great working with this company to we were kind of the beta testers in trying out a lot of this. And this was one of our most successful synthesis techniques. And this is a plot showing the different materials that we were able to synthesize. So the ones that are filled in solid are the ones synthesized. The ones that are hollow are, the ones that are solid are synthesized. The ones that are hollow were just, solid is tested. Hollow is just synthesized. And the reason why we didn't test everything is what I mentioned before. Sometimes you will create a material, and it's not a single material. It's actually a combination of multiple materials, like in multiple phases. So we really only, we favored testing samples that looked like they were homogeneous, like a single crystal structure material. All right. And then for testing, basically we do the testing in parallel. Each one of those things on the table there is like a separate little reactor. And then that pipes off the gas that is the product into another machine to then tell you which gases you actually produced and the quantity. All right? All right, so now we just created a bunch of data points. And we created over 200 data points here, which if you were looking at it from an AI kind of machine learning perspective, you're like, 200 data points? Like, you really, we usually think in the millions, right? But 200 data points, when you think about chemistry, is actually a lot. It's really hard to find 200 data points done in a way that is done consistently. And the other thing about the tests that we did do them at higher current densities, so that way they'd be more amenable to more industrially relevant. So we were done up to a current density of 300 milliamps for those that know about that. So basically it's done at higher current densities than you normally would do in lab type of experiments. So now what we want to do is we want to try to predict what we saw in the lab using those absorption energies that we calculated. So what we're going to do is we take the material, we have all the different surfaces, we compute all the different absorption energies, and we need to combine those absorption energies together in a way that allows us to then calculate the overall reaction of that material. The most naive thing you can do is take all those absorption energies and just average them. Right? It is the most naive thing. It makes me kind of cringe a little bit because it's so naive. Because obviously that catalyst itself, there's only some surfaces that are realized. Like some of them won't even happen. And then some surfaces will be bigger, some surfaces will be smaller. Be a lot more, it'd be like a lot more interesting if you had a more complex way of doing it. We tried a lot of other ways of doing it, but at the end of the day, averaging worked the best. So this is, I think, a really interesting area to explore in the future of how to improve upon this. So basically take those absorption energies. We just did a linear model in this case, and then we could do a prediction of the experimental results. And what you see here is the x-axis is the experimental voltage, and then you have the predicted voltage. And basically we're looking for a linear fit between the two. The gray bar here shows you what we predict as like the experimental error, because we did a bunch of duplicate testing as well to get a sense of what the error bars are. And you can see ones that matched to in solid, they're the ones that match to the XRD signal matched up for those. XRD tells you the crystal structure, and if the crystal structure looked like it matched what the structure that we were computing computationally, those are the ones that are solid, and then the hollow ones are the ones that didn't have that, but they still were useful in training. So we see it's not exact, but it's a decent correlation here. So it could potentially be useful. So that was kind of interesting. So this is just the experimental data. Now what's interesting is we wanted to create, remember we talked about this volcano plot. So what if we did something like this volcano plot with those 19,000 materials that I mentioned before? So we computed absorption energies not just on the experimental data, but on all 19,000 materials. So what if we create a volcano plot for those 19,000 materials? So for those, we have like 19,000. It took a huge number of relaxations and calculations to do that, but we were able to do it. And the random result was this, which is pretty cool because it created something that looks like a volcano plot. And what's interesting, one of the most interesting things we found was we didn't have any platinum in our training data set. We didn't do an experimental test on platinum. And platinum is known to be one of the better catalysts for this reaction. And we found that it's where the red star is, it actually is it is predicted to be one of the best catalysts for this reaction. And it also predicted a lot of other platinum alloys as well. We will be releasing these results next week. And you can look through, we have a list of several hundred interesting catalysts for this that are in there. We're not saying all of them are good. Obviously, there's a lot of noise in this. These are just like, grain of salt, that sort of thing. But it was pretty cool to see that. Now, if you can do the same thing, but you use not instead of absorption energy features, you use MapMiner features. And these features are features of like the bulk materials, like which elements are in the bulk. They're much simpler features. They don't actually model the interaction of the molecules with the catalyst. They actually get similar, like if you go back 2 slides, you look at the correlation, they get similar correlation. But if you look at the volcano plot, it doesn't generalize nearly as well because it's showing a lot of things work better than platinum. So it's nice to see at least that absorption energies are a reasonable descriptor for this problem. All right, let's talk about CO2RR. Now, one thing you should know about HER versus CO2RR, HER, just splitting water. Super easy chemical reaction. CO2R, it's this mess. It is like insanity. Like you have all these different intermediates. You can produce like tons of different products. It's a very, very complex chemical reaction. It's kind of like, in my mind, it's kind of like the holy grail. If we can be predictive of CO2R, that means that we like have really taken a step in solving this problem. So this I look at as like HER is like the simple problem, and this is like the grand challenge in a way to be able to solve this. So not too surprisingly, the correlations weren't as strong here because it's much harder. So here we actually used 6 different absorption energies. And here we found that the best classifier was no longer a linear model because that wasn't expressive enough. Instead, we used a random forest model. And that was much better. And I think that is good to me as a machine learning person that says that this is a more complex problem. There's a lot of things, there are things going on that have a lot of complexity in them that we need to model. So we have there, if you do your cross-validation where you leave out entire compositions, it does even worse. But I think there's a lot of we have this data now. I think there's a lot of really interesting room to do additional research in this space. I think it'll be really exciting to play with this data and try to fit this more. All right, so I need to wrap up. So let's just talk about some challenges. This data set, we've got 200 data points in it. It's awesome. It's good size. It needs to be 100 times bigger. So we're trying to figure out how do we get the funding, how do we get people on board to do this, work with the rest of the experimental computational community to make this happen. When we do relaxations, we do these things with ML models. Which one of these are correct? Half of them are right, half of them are wrong. We have no idea which one's which, in this example. Like, we need good metrics of uncertainty. These are how we're modeling our catalyst right now, a nice clean catalyst surface with a single absorbate on top. In real life, it's a lot messier. You have water floating around. You have other absorbates. The catalyst surface isn't perfect. We need to do a better job. The other thing is reactions in nature happen really quickly. Experiments happen really slowly. ML models happen faster, but there's still a massive gap between the two. If we want to actually literally model a chemical reaction or model these things that are happening, we need our ML models to be a lot more efficient, or we need to get a lot more compute to model these longer time scales, to do things like molecular dynamics, to actually model chemical reactions, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of interestingness in kind of making things even 2 or 3 orders more in magnitude faster than where they currently are. All right. And today I've been talking a lot about catalysts and that sort of thing, but these techniques that we've been developing, they're useful for a huge amount of variety of different applications. You have direct air capture, sorbents, you have batteries, you have proteins, you have drug discovery, hazardous waste cleanup. There's just so many great uses here. I know that as a community, we're really focused on large language models. We're really focused on generating like cool images. But you think about where your work could have impact, real, practical, real-world impact. Like solving these problems, like these are important problems. Like it'd be great. It's been great to watch the ML AI community get more and more involved in this. It'd be great to even have even more. And one way I look at this is that we are basically building a new microscope. Like think about how the microscope changed how we look at different problems. By having DFT, by having these things run efficiently, allowing people to kind of play around and study and work on these things, we're giving people new ways of looking at these problems and build intuition. It is a lot of ways just building this new scientific like measuring device. And that's exciting. So I mentioned in the very beginning, Haber and Bosch, they allowed the world to grow. But it wasn't all good. Chemistry has dual uses. The same underlying technology was used to supply munitions to Germany during World War I. Overuse of ammonia fertilizers leading to ocean dead zones. All these technologies have double-edged swords. It's important for us to be studying problems that we think are going to be useful and impactful to the community. If you want to learn more about this, especially the technical part, there is a YouTube series out there. Check it out. And thanks to my team. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
So thank you for the nice talk. I was wondering how's the transferability of the model. For example, you mentioned the batteries and proteins. Does the trained model work to describe ion diffusion and protein structures?
Yeah, the models do a decent job of extrapolating beyond the exact things that they were trained on, but not too far. So for instance, in the Catalyst, we trained them on relaxations. We used them to compute transition energies, and they hadn't seen any transition states before, and they were able to generalize to that pretty well. Within the space of different materials, it generalizes pretty well. If you wanted to go from materials to molecules, like let's say take the OC20 dataset, train a model on that, and then use that for modeling proteins, it's not going to do as well. That being said, as a team, we keep producing more and more data sets, and we are actively working on that right now, because what we've seen them generalize quite well, and what we're trying to do is kind of get a good enough sampling of different domains in different areas, so that way we can build a universal kind of DFT surrogate, which will work across all these different domains. So that is our end goal, and we are working towards. Essentially, the team is we're always building new data sets and trying to get out there to the community to make these tools as useful to as many people as possible. We just haven't. Our team personally hasn't been working as much on the biospace. Yeah.
So starting from the first paper that you showed, like it's amazing that they were able to actually design these, this catalyst using just intuition and not these tools that you have today, right? So I was like, are there ways to think about trying to capture some of these ways that the chemists were thinking about when designing without having these massive search engines that you're building today and encode that to make this even more efficient?
Yeah, so Haber and Bosch actually had another partner, which I'm blanking on his name right now, I feel really bad, who actually, the reason they found a new catalyst was because they literally ran 2,000 experiments. And they tried everything they could, until they found one that worked.
2,000 doesn't seem enough. Like they lucked out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it is still an open research problem to find something that works better than what they're currently using, to create ammonia. So it is. It allowed them to find something that was economically feasible at the time to do, but it is like, if you want to be game changing, if you really want to make this and explore like a wide swath of materials, we need to have other ways that are just orders of magnitude more efficient. And I think these computational approaches is one possible avenue there.
I guess what I was asking, just to be clear, is whether you can try and capture whatever intuition that you can to cut down even more in the computational approach.
It's an interesting question. I kind of go back and forth on this. So like a lot of times you have the generative models. So then you want to generate new materials that have a certain property, and you can imagine feedback loops that do that. Another method you could do it is to mine literature. Use the large language models to mine all the chemistry literature and then give you suggestions. So this is just my personal feeling, is that like mining the literature, which is where the intuition lies, will get you a certain distance. But if we want to go kind of outside the box of what humans have explored so far, we need to kind of, like, that'll only take us like so far. We need to kind of unleash ML to like explore brand new spaces. So I think we will see, and the community's doing that. There's papers out there, exploring the literature. A-Lab has done a lot of that, as well. And oxide, how do you actually, what's a cooking recipe for making a new oxide? Like they've been using that to like come up with cooking recipes. So I think that's a good area of research, but I do think there are limitations to it. It'd be better for it to be data-driven, from the experiments if you can do that at scale. Yeah.
Do you see these approaches translating to not solid phase middle catalysts? And do you see it applying to like organic catalysts,
Yeah.
like in aqueous phase, for example?
One of our data sets is ODAC 23, which is for sorbents for direct air capture, which has MOFs in it, metal organic frameworks. So those, like that is an example of obviously organics and metals combined together. We've also used this for purely organic materials as well. It works well. You just need different training data. You need the right training data to make that work. But yes, the underlying principles, underlying models work well across many different things. And if you train, there's other data sets for molecules that are out there that are smaller that that our team hasn't created, but other teams have created. We train our models on that, and these models work well there as well. But I do think as long as you have a model with enough expressivity, and you have enough training data, you generally are doing fairly well.
Last question.
In the table of models that you showed, there was one in the fourth row, which was a GNOME model. It seemed to have about 1/5 the parameters that you had in your model. Could you just give us an illustration of this?
Yeah, so Genome is the model from Google. That model was, I think we designed that in 2020. It's a little bit older. We have different versions of our model as well. One of the challenges you have, and this is what we found as well, is a lot of the models that we've developed are purposely big because we want to take advantage of the larger data sets that we're making. So we've always been optimizing our models for large data sets. Now, if you take those same models and you apply them to smaller data sets, a lot of times they don't perform state of the art because they'll overfit. They won't work as well, right? So you need to basically tune like the model size to the to the data set size. So we had 2 models there. I think the first model that I showed had a much smaller size because it only had a million examples for training. So in order to essentially regularize that model, you want to have a smaller model size. But then as you have like these larger data sets, you want to have bigger models. Now there is some practical implications of that. Like if you train these models that are super accurate, but they're really big, then computationally it's inference time, it's expensive then. So there are it really depends upon your application and how you're using it and how are you using this kind of as a one-off thing as like a DFT surrogate, or are you like brute forcing 19,000 different materials and you just a little bit of accuracy loss is fine because you're using a lot of compute.
Thank you so much again.